Europe condemns the United States for its withdrawal from Afghanistan. We'll discuss what the souring of relations means and the future of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Hello, I'm Anton Fedyashin, and this is The Heat. Some of the United States' closest allies are outraged over how the United States handled the withdrawal from Afghanistan. European leaders say they're frustrated over Washington's lack of communication and consideration for the drawdown of NATO troops. At the British Parliament, former British Prime Minister Theresa May questioned the United Kingdom's reliance on the United States and the role of NATO.
What does it say about us as a country? What does it say about NATO if we are entirely dependent on a unilateral decision taken by the United States? Yes. We all understand the importance of American support, but despite the comments from my right honourable friend earlier, I do find it incomprehensible and worrying that the United Kingdom was not able to bring together not a military solution, but an alternative alliance of countries to continue to provide the support necessary to sustain a government in Afghanistan. Surely one outcome of this must be a reassessment of how NATO operates.
Well, for more now on the growing tensions, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Victor Gao. He's a chair professor with Soochow University and a current affairs commentator. Also with us, Anton Fedyashin is a Russian affairs expert and professor of history at American University right here in Washington, D.C. Lincoln Mitchell is a U.S. political analyst and adjunct associate professor of political science at Columbia University in New York. And Klaus Larres is a distinguished professor of history and international affairs with the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and author of the forthcoming book, Uncertain Allies, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Threat of a United Europe. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. And Klaus Larres, let me start with you. It's been clear for some time now that the Europeans are unhappy with the Biden administration. There have been concerns for some time, but it came out into the open after that chaotic U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. This is how ARMIN, who is Germany's conservative candidate to succeed Angela Merkel, described it. Let's listen to him.
This is the greatest defeat of the Western alliance since its existence, and that is why we must now draw conclusions from it. And the consequence must be we need more European unity in order to be able to secure an airport like Kabul airport ourselves one day.
So, Klaus, these are tough words. He didn't hold anything back there, not very diplomatic either. How serious is this rupture?
It's a serious rupture. I mean, everyone had hoped that Biden would be a transatlantic president, that he said that America is back, that it wants to cooperate with its European allies. And Biden's first trip was to Europe as president. And now that debacle with the withdrawal from Afghanistan and that total non-consultation and non-coordination with the European allies. And that was really a shock to everyone in Europe. And we just heard Theresa May, who was profoundly shocked by that and was very disappointed that the Europeans, including the British, were unable to do anything themselves, that without the Americans they were totally helpless. They were dependent on that airlift on American support and help. And this is, of course, a frustrating situation. And there have been many calls to bring back something like a European pillar in NATO to make the European pillar much stronger and more independent from the United States. French President Macron has been asking for that for many years, but no one is really listening. Though now the situation seems to be different, but I wonder, are the European populations prepared to spend the money? Is there the political will? And I think once the Afghanistan debacle has been forgotten in a few weeks, in a few months' time, then the European public may not be all that keen to spend so much money to strengthen the European military. So it will be necessary, and European politicians want to strengthen a united European army, a European military, but I think the public will is not there, and I can't see that that will change in the near future.
Klaus, as you say, Joe Biden was seen as the president who would restore the relationship with Europe. He came to office saying that that was one of his priorities, and he's only been in office now for what, about 8 months or 9 months. What do you think has changed?
I think the situation has changed. No one expected that sudden debacle in Afghanistan, and Biden believed that he had to act in the interest of the United States, the national interest of the United States, that there was no time to consult with the allies, that they could not, for example, take the the British wish, for example, the European wish on board to extend the deadline of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The deadline, as you know, was the 31st of August. The British asked him to stay a week longer so that more people could be evacuated. And for military reasons, for political reasons, Biden believed that was not possible and turned them down. So he looked after the American national interest, and the Europeans were really sacrificed. They really were not all that important for the United States. That doesn't mean that now in the next crisis, Biden may not try to cooperate a little bit more, but the last resort, you know, it is America's national interest which comes first for Joe Biden.
Right. Lincoln Mitchell, great to have you with us on the show. What is your assessment of the current state of United States-Europe relations? I mean, how did it get to this point? Has there been something of a foreign policy management problem here in Washington over the past few months?
Well, I'm really struck by a couple of things. The first is the use of the word debacle over and over to describe what was the largest evacuation perhaps in human history. And it was messy at times, and it was very chaotic at first, and there was some tragic loss of life. But the word debacle is a bit of an overstatement. I was really struck that what Theresa May said, what the German politicians said, and what Macron said, those are all things that many in America would agree with. And I think the previous speaker got it right. It is easy, and it's kind of what we hear a lot from Europe, and they're right about this, that America is going to act in its national interest. I don't think the United States is the only country in the world that acts in its national interest. And to hold the United States to that standard where it's not going to act in its national interest, that's kind of absurd. And the United States and Biden is a believer, let's say this, Joe Biden and the Biden administration is a believer in NATO and the NATO alliance. And if members within NATO or groups of members within NATO want to invest more in defense, play a more active role in the collective defense, play a more active and put more money into joint NATO projects, that would be great. I don't think anyone in the Biden administration is going to have a problem with that. So I think there's a lot more room for agreement here than disagreement. I would also add that, you know, European and American relations, that transatlantic relationship always looks better from 10 years in the past. At the moment, it always seems fraught. I've been paying attention to these political questions for a long time and to this alliance for a long time, and I can't think of a moment other than maybe the very early months of Barack Obama's presidency where everyone said, hey, things are going great. So that's just kind of the nature of the beast. There's a tendency now to overstate it. There's certainly a partisan issue here in the United States where the Republicans want to treat this as if this was, you know, the biggest military defeat in American history. The real debacle in Afghanistan was the 20-year war. And Joe Biden's courageous move to follow through and to end it is, you could say that's putting American national interests first, but I don't think domestically people here don't see it as a debacle. I think domestically a lot of people in Europe see it as it's about time this war ended. So I think there's a tendency to really overstate the problem.
Yeah, Lincoln, I think there are others who have also said that the use of terms like debacle, they've even called it a disaster and a catastrophe, is an exaggeration. But do you think the lack of communication with the Europeans has put something of a question mark over the United States' commitment to Europe and perhaps, you know, the way Europe sees the U.S. credibility in this alliance?
Well, I think there is a question mark over the United States' relationship with Europe, and I think there is a question of America's credibility. But I think Joe Biden could have communicated it better, but I don't think that's the issue here. The issue here, a lot of the Europeans I talk to, a lot of the European diplomats and scholars I talk to, what they tell me is, we don't know what to do because there's a real possibility that the Trump people get back in again, and who don't want to be in NATO, who don't believe in democracy, who don't really believe in this alliance. And that's the real threat here. That's the real question mark that hangs over this. And I'm not comfortable engaging in a conversation that begins with what, from the American perspective, are Republican talking points.
Anton Fedyashin, transatlantic relations, until very recently, were cemented in the aftermath of World War II. That's when NATO was created. It was also the beginning of the Cold War, and the United States and its European allies stood together, united against what was then the Soviet Union in that Cold War. But the world has now changed, hasn't it? And there is no longer a Soviet Union, there is no longer a Cold War, and Europe wants autonomy, both economic and strategic. Has this alliance actually outlived its usefulness?
Well, listen, that's a great question, Anand, that's been asked within the alliance for the past, 30 years now, but it has survived. The interesting thing for me about NATO is that it was created as a standoff alliance, and at that, it has been spectacularly successful. As Lord Ismay said, famously at the very creation, it was put together to keep the Germans down, the Americans in, the Russians out, and that's more or less what it did until the end of the Cold War. And then it simply continued because that's what human institutions do. Once you have budgetary currents running all over the place, it's very difficult to turn them off. The other side of NATO is, of course, its military footprint, its military capability. And unfortunately, from NATO's perspective, as we saw in Afghanistan, the military operational side of NATO leaves a lot to be desired. 20 years in Afghanistan with very little to show for it, unfortunately, is not something to shout about. So as an institution, it is successful. As a military fighting organization, much less so. For the Russians, of course, it was NATO expansion towards their borders. That's the constant trigger of all sorts of crises. And from that perspective, listen, there are two sides to this issue. Yes, every country has a right to decide what alliance it wants to become a member of. On the other hand, from an institutional perspective, again, NATO is one of the most successful organizations in the world because its expansion seems to stimulate the very crises that it exists to solve. And from a purely budgetary perspective, that's exactly where any institution wants to be, because it assures that money will keep flowing into your coffers regardless of how you actually do on the military battlefield.
Right, but Anton, do you think there is, or there are questions being asked in Europe about the usefulness of NATO? I mean, we heard Theresa May there. She said, what does it say about NATO if we are entirely dependent on a unilateral decision taken by the United States? This is supposedly an alliance.
Anand, there's nothing new in this. Theresa May have said this. Mind you, she never said anything like that when she was prime minister. So yes, once people are out of power, they get a little bit more leeway, and that's perfectly normal. It happens everywhere in the U.S. and Europe. But NATO's not going anywhere until the Europeans decide to fork up for their defense. And as Klaus absolutely correctly, I think, noted in the beginning, I seriously doubt, and as does he, that the Europeans will actually pay that money. And so NATO is just going to continue. As for the relationship, by the way, listen, Zbigniew Brzezinski, one of the brighter minds on the American geopolitical firmament, famously wrote in his book from 1997, The Grand Chessboard, he called the Europeans and other American allies vassals. It's actually in the book on at least 2 occasions that I can remember, and that relationship is going to continue. Look, NATO has several tiers, 2 tiers. There are the great powers. In Europe, they would be Britain, Germany, and France, perhaps Italy, but there's a whole slew of countries that have nowhere else to go. Where are the Lithuanians going to turn except for the United States? Where are the Poles? Where are the Czechs?
Victor Gao, let's go to Beijing and talk to Victor. Victor, one of the big changes that's taken place recently, of course, is the rise of China. It is now the biggest trading partner for many European countries. It is also one of the world's biggest economies, the second biggest economy in the world. How do you see these tensions play out between the United States and Europe? Is there some kind of realignment taking place right now in global affairs?
Thank you very much. Allow me to make several very brief points. First of all, for the United States to serve the best interests of the American people, that's logical and that's natural. However, allow me to emphasize, serving the fundamental interests of the United States should involve close consultation with its NATO members. if you believe you can serve the best interests of the American people without close consultation with the Americans' allies, NATO members, for example, you are defeating your proposition to start with. Secondly, from the military perspective, for anyone with any iota of military knowledge, the withdrawal from Afghanistan is completely a disaster. And this is against the background of a 20-year-old war. And I think any justification of why this withdrawal was handled like this was not going to stand. History will mark it as the darkest day in history of the U.S. military history. And I think there was complete breakdown between the among the U.S. Aspects, for example, the military versus the civilian versus the State Department, etc. How can the military run away without evacuating the civilians first? Now, secondly, there was complete breakdown between the military of the United States and the Afghan national troops.
Yeah.
How could you expect that the Afghan defense forces stand the ground once they look over their shoulder and the Americans were completely run away? And then thirdly, relevant to our discussion, there was complete breakdown between the Americans and its NATO members. Now, from the Chinese perspective, we believe the 20-year-old war in Afghanistan was wrong to start with, and the Americans should reach their own conclusion that they should no longer overreach going forward. Another point is that China believes that NATO should not overexpand, especially deeper and deeper towards the Soviet border, because that will trigger more tension and antagonism and suspicion from the Russian side towards the NATO. And another thing, allow me to emphasize very briefly, I think there is complete and profound second guessing among NATO members against the United States. And I will not be surprised if the second guessing becomes a third guessing or fourth guessing going forward, if Washington does not come to its senses that it is not handling itself responsibly as the big brother among NATO members.
Right.
It should take care of its own responsibility for the American people, but equally for its allies. China will never do anything like this going forward. China cares about itself. China cares about its partnership or strategic relations with anyone in the world. And this will be a cornerstone of what China will stand for going forward.
Klaus Larres, as Victor says, there could be questions being asked in Europe, or second guessing, as he puts it, even third guessing about the role of NATO. But I think it's fair to say that US relations with Europe really sunk to their lowest level during the Trump administration, when Trump went about with his doctrine of America first. You know, then Joe Biden comes along and says that restoring relations with the Europeans is one of his priorities. America first was replaced with America is back. But is America back?
Well, where should the Europeans go? They have nowhere else to go. They, of course, can strengthen their own military performance, and I think over time this will happen. But they are still totally dependent on the American ally. And Biden is certainly a better president and a more pro-European, more NATO-friendly, more pro-transatlantic relations president than Trump ever was. So there will be a lot of discontent with the Biden administration. The Biden administration will realize that and will try to do some work to placate the Europeans and perhaps do better next time around when the next crisis comes. But NATO is not going to break up, but a lot of work, internal work within the coalition, the NATO coalition, the NATO alliance has to be done to really mend fences again. But as I said at the beginning, the Europeans have nowhere else to go. There couldn't be a better, more pro-European president than Joe Biden. He has proven to be not as great as the Europeans expected and hoped for, but there's no choice but to work with him. They have no other option. And I think that is what we will see in the near future, that both the Europeans and the Biden administration will try to really overcome that, and I think it was a debacle, that debacle of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, which showed great incompetence, but everyone will say we have to go beyond that and try to do better next time round.
Lincoln Mitchell, as Klaus Larres well, poses the question, where can Europe go? But if we look at what's happened just today, Wednesday, the European Union chief Ursula von der Leyen said Europe will soon boost its own military capacity after the collapse of the US-backed government in Afghanistan. I mean, surely when you hear something like that, it must be sending alarm bells and setting alarm bells off in Washington.
There are a lot of people in Washington who, in the foreign policy establishment, who are delighted to hear that. The alliance between the United States and Europe and the NATO members is strong. And a stronger, if the United Kingdom invests more in its military, if Italy invests more in its military, if Poland or if Estonia, some of the smaller countries, as was mentioned, if they invest more in their military, so that the next time we need a NATO project, it is not the United States and then as the not just the big brother, but perhaps the gigantic brother, as the speaker, one of the speakers said. That is what the United States wants. This is not a threat to the United States. Our allies being powerful and investing more in defense is not a threat to the United States. Some other countries are, yes, but not our allies. So it is completely a misreading of the situation to say this is terrible for the United States. I also just want to echo something Klaus said, because in the language of where else is Europe going to go, I think that's right. But another way to think of that is, if Europeans have a problem with Joe Biden, they are never going to get along with an American president. And
go ahead. Yeah.
No, and so there are certainly some in Europe, and I think that's right. The communication here could have been better. But this was a treaty that the previous administration had signed. The United States government had, and Joe Biden had been wanting to get out of this war for a long time, and the debacle was the 20 years of war. And the problem with the war in Afghanistan, and one of the reasons it lasted for 20 years virtually, is because there was always a reason to be in it another day, another week, another month, and never to be in it for another 10 years. But pretty soon, a day here, a week there, a month there, and you're talking about 10 years. And that's why for President Biden, the August 31st deadline was so important. And I do not agree this will be seen as the darkest day in American history. There are a number of bodies at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean and Pearl Harbor that would say that that might be the darkest day in American military history. This will be seen as a turning point. And this will be seen as Joe Biden having done the right thing. And the evacuation will be seen as a success. And a generation from now, when those tens of thousands of Afghans who got out and will be in the United States are entering our law schools and our medical schools, it will be seen as a success for the United States. And the images, which are unfortunate, will fade away.
Anton Fedyashin, the United States has been calling upon its European allies to join its efforts to isolate Russia, especially in the wake of the Ukraine crisis. And the Europeans, to some extent, have resisted this. I mean, we look at Germany, for instance. It refused to terminate that gas pipeline deal with Russia. I mean, that deal still needs parliamentary approval in Germany. But are we seeing realpolitik winning the day here?
Well, always in relations between Europe and Russia. And this is not the first time, by the way, in history that the Europeans have, I wouldn't say ignored, but outmaneuvered the United States trying to block, for example, pipelines, because this happened in the early days of the Reagan administration in the 1980s. Look, the pipeline is the Nord Stream 2, what we're talking about now. This is a project that is economically viable and profitable for Germany and a large chunk of Europe, which is why it's already finished physically, and it will be certified and completed within weeks, maybe a couple of months at the most. Yes, this is realpolitik, because this is ultimately economics. As for the isolating Russia, look, if you focus on the sanctions, yes, the Russians are under European sanctions. On the other hand, in terms of diplomacy, the Russians are anything but isolated, because Putin has had non-stop and constant meetings with European leaders for the past 7 years since the Ukraine crisis has broken out. And the Russians are diversifying and have diversified their geopolitical portfolio to the point where they are actually cooperating with every major Eurasian nation and beyond there, and are now playing a very important role in the Middle East, and will be for sure in Afghanistan. One of the indications of that, by the way, is today in Dushanbe, the Collective Security Treaty Organization. The foreign and defense ministers and national security advisors met about Afghanistan. Tomorrow, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization begins. Yep. So the Russians have many alternatives to Europe, but they've made clear that they're willing to cooperate with the Europeans if they are approached as equal partners.
Victor Gao, you know, there are tensions between the United States and China right now, and those tensions are growing all the time. In fact, Chinese President Xi Jinping has called on the United States to set aside ideological differences so that these two countries could avoid a Cold War. And when President Xi Jinping said that, it was endorsed by none other than Angela Merkel, the outgoing Chancellor of Germany. I mean, what can we read into that? How significant was it that Angela Merkel says, look, I think what Xi Jinping, the president of China, is saying is something we should look at seriously?
Well, first of all, I think President Xi Jinping made remarks, very important remarks to President Biden in their 90 minutes long phone call. Secondly, I think China appreciates the kindness and the objectivity of the remarks from Chancellor Angela Merkel. Why? Because first of all, a Cold War between China and the United States is not going to be constructive at all by any stretch of the imagination for China or for the United States. And China and the United States need to get along. And I think what General Milley's alleged phone calls to his counterparts in China on January the 8th, 2021, immediately after the siege of the Capitol Hill, revealed that both the Chinese military and the American military do not want to have a war against each other, because the war, if ever, will be self-destructive. It will soon escalate into an Armageddon, which is not in the Americans' interest, neither in the Chinese interest. So I never believe a war, in the real sense of the word, will break out between China and the United States. And Cold War is not going to work at all.
Lincoln Mitchell, very quickly, I've only got about a minute left. Has the United States now got other priorities? You know, a few years back, the United States was talking about the pivot to Asia. Maybe Europe is not that big a priority as it used to be.
The top American priority now is domestic, and international audiences must understand that. We are in a crisis of our democracy. 1 out of every 500 Americans has died of COVID. We have extraordinary racial tension. And for President Biden, who would have liked to have been a foreign, you know, if he was younger when he first ran for president in 1988 or something, jetting around the world, solving the world's problems, you know, talking to foreign leaders, he is looking inward. America has pivoted to America. Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.